what I've been doing a lot of lately with this project is just exploring. And when I'm doing that sort of work, a big part of what I'm actually trying to get done is to generate a list of ideas or a to-do list. At this point, I've got a pretty long one, a pretty long to-do list. So I think what's up next is to start just checking a lot of that stuff off and see what happens when I check them off, see if it gets us to a good spot, see which ones are good ideas and all that stuff. First of all, when I looked at my to-do list, I saw that I was kind of generating two different kinds of to-do items. Some of my ideas were about new effects to try, like new ways to create a particular wave shape or ways to blend certain things, what math to try next, doing, bends in different ways or filters or, all these different ideas. And then a lot of the other items that I have would fall into the category of sort of making new building blocks or how to organize the code to make it more useful or how to make mechanisms that would simplify the process of constructing sounds, make a timeline or, create specific multi-pass API that works a little more easily than like what I'm doing now where I have a single loop with lots of different sounds blended in together. So I want to kind of focus on those building block ideas first because they're going to make it much easier to do the generative exploration later. If I reverse the order, then instead what I would end up with is a bunch of code that's written in a fairly sloppy way to explore effects and then a big pass to do a bunch of simplification that would be much harder because there's a lot more usage code to change. Now, the usage code could sometimes be a useful guiding mechanism. If you write a bunch of usage code and then you go do the API cleanups, you might find that the usage code helps to guide you a little bit more clearly. But I also find that like if you have, 1,000 lines of usage code before you start cleaning up the API, now you've got 1,000 lines to tweak. And so each cleanup is harder to apply. It's a little bit more laborious to like try and experiment with the API. Since I have a little bit of confidence in my ability to like notice and steer away from bad API situations and to come up with good API ideas, I have some confidence that I can do that. I trust myself a little more to start with the building blocks and then to try them out later. And if there is a huge flaw, I'll go to the drawing board again. But I think it will save me time of, I can get a lot of the common sense stuff right, I think, on a first pass over that building block stuff. So that's where I want to start today. In particular, here's the list I've got that I'm going to start with. I'm not going to bother to explain any of them up front because, like I have been saying, this is a new space for me. I don't know if any of these are good ideas or what will come out of them. I could maybe try to explain why I think they're a useful thing to do these first, but it's a little bit subtle. It's just my gut feeling that like these are the things my brain has generated while I've been doing other tasks throughout this last few episodes. My brain generated these ideas, so I'm gonna just try them out and see what happens. And if something comes up while I'm cranking through this to-do list in this episode, and if something comes up that I think is interesting enough to talk about, then I'll stop and talk about it. And at the end, I'll review everything that I did and see what the final result looks like. But otherwise, I don't know what I should talk about besides just whatever comes up when I try these ideas. So I'm going to get into that. Okay, I stopped for just a second so that I could extend my to-do list because I've just thought of a couple of specific ideas. This is often what happens when I take the time to first organize some code. I start looking at what I've got and fresh ideas start popping up. And these are things that are directly fitting in with the theme of the to-do list I'm already cranking on. So I'm just going to take these two new ideas and put them onto the current to-do list and try to get them done as well as everything else while I'm going. Okay, so the idea I just was working on, I think, has a little bit of subtlety to it that is worth explaining. It has to relate to the choice of, weighing the choice of API strength versus like performance stuff in this case. Because what I did is I originally had written this generator that we have right now as two big loops, one for each major sound that were sort of rendered into the output. And so what would happen is every time I wanted to tweak one of these sounds, I was basically going into this big loop that renders a sound, and then each sample was generated once, right? So my loop looked kind of like this, right? I have one loop, and at each step of the loop, I'm generating a sample, and I generate everything about that sample there, and then I go to the next step, and that sample never gets touched again. And what I've switched to is instead doing multiple passes over the buffer like this. So now each shape I'm putting in is a concept that gets its own pass and gets mixed in, and then the way the math ends up working out, I can do all of those since they're sums. The order can be applied this way, where I'm not combining them all, in one step and then finally writing out to the buffer, but rather I'm accumulating the intermediates inside the buffer. I don't think that this is probably not a performance optimization, but it is sort of an API optimization because it lets me write code like this where I don't have to control parameters from fairly far away from where they get used to tweak how a thing works, but I'm sort of much more close to the moment the decision gets made is where I can tune the parameters, right? And it kind of just lets me mix and match pre-existing pieces more easily. With what I had before, I would have had to make a big call that I would have pulled that all out, and like every time I wanted to generate a signal from these things and mix them together, it would be this whole thing where I would have to tune the parameters for the whole thing. Even if I knew I wasn't going to do square, or it turned out I didn't want to do square, it would still be in there in zeros and just generating nothing. So now I can just skip that, which is a little bit of a performance improvement, even though at the limit it's worse. And the other cool thing is now I can like easily add new shapes without having to go and push it into the switch and complicate things. So I think this is the right way for me to do it while I'm doing experimental stuff. If it turns out later that I have a fairly narrow idea of like, oh, I want to create these effects, which I'm not even necessarily sure I'm driving towards that point anyways, but that would be the time to like figure out a different approach that's more build up from the things we know we need, but we don't know what we need right now. What I mostly need is the flexibility to be able to add in more effects whenever I think of them without it being complicated. And I think this does a really good job of keeping the effects separated from each other and still possible to compose in ways that make sense. So that's why we're going with that. In addition to that API decision, I've got a couple more ideas. One of the first ones to do here, which is just, I think it'd be neat to have the frequency. So in this case, 44100, the frequency as in the frequency of the actual output buffer, the number of samples per second we can render, and the delta t, which is just the reciprocal of that. So how much time passes between each sample. I think it would be cool to pass those around as a pair, because if I just pass one of them, like if I decide to always pass the frequency, so like the number of samples per second, then whenever I needed to do like a delta t operation, so like adding a little bit to the number to a t value, right? Delta t, I usually use that for incrementing a t value over time or multiplying to get a t value. Whenever I needed one of those, I would need to do a divide on the thing that got passed around, right? So the 44100 would get past me, and I would have to first do the reciprocal of that, which is a divide operation, and then I could use it to do whatever the t work was. And the same thing will happen if I pass the delta t around, and it turns out that I want to convert if I want to convert a t time into a sample index, what I actually need to do is multiply by 44100, but what I have is the reciprocal of that, so I would have to divide again. So I was thinking it might be cool, since they're each 4 bytes, to treat them as a pair and make it an 8-byte thing I can pass around. That's basically like, hey, I'm going to do the reciprocal up front once, and I'm going to pass around the value and its reciprocal as a pair, so you always can do a multiply anywhere downstream of the very first time we decide the frequency. So I'm going to put that in there. The other idea I have is it's not really a to-do because I haven't done anything I think that violates this idea yet. But I'm just thinking moving forward and kind of based on that idea of passing around the pair, I'll just try to always use time coordinates. It could get a little confusing, I think, if I have APIs that want to say like, oh, I affect these range of samples, and then, oh, I start at this time t, and like you have to know when to convert and when not to. I think if I always use time as my API like parameters for now, that's gonna be favorable to like the things I want to do is like when I'm tweaking a sound and making it sound right, I'm gonna want to think in terms of time coordinates. So I'm gonna have all the APIs give me time coordinates, and then since I'm passing around this pair thing, just a multiply will happen inside whenever some decision needs to get made about where to place a particular thing in terms of the stream of samples. So I think with the to do of the first one and the idea that goes with it there, I maybe have an idea of how to control the language of the system in terms of how it relates to time, and not let it get like, not make it unnecessarily full of conversions and full of divides all over the place. So I don't know. I think that's going to be a neat thing to try. I have a couple of things in there right now. There are a bit of there's like a few subtle like hacks, a bit of sloppiness that makes it slightly less useful to use than it looks, sort of stuff. I want to go in there and leave some notes in the code where I'm a little nervous about where I'm still letting things be sloppy. We're not going to let it to be that way forever, but while it's sloppy, I think it's good to have a bit of code or a bit of note right in the code, not just in my notebook, uh, so that I can like walk away from it. And if I forget and I don't switch back to my notebook or someone else is looking at the code, they know what the weird, surprising stuff is. I'm going to leave a couple notes, and then I'm going to mess with this timeline stuff. Also do the original timeline to do idea I had. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with where I got so far on the use of time coordinates, the rate thing. I messed around a little bit with bundling the rate with the buffer or not, and a couple of questions like that. It's looking like it's pretty good. There are definitely a couple of rough spots. I don't know for sure, like the timeline thing I added, which is useful, but does it need to have a rate inside of it? Should I be using time coordinates or index coordinates for that? I said I should use time coordinates everywhere, but like if I'm bundling the rate into everything, I start to get that feels a little bit, I don't know. There's something wrong about that in my head. There's pitfalls that could be leading to, and I don't know for sure. So, point is, there's these rough spots where I don't know what the best thing to do is yet, and I think the only way to get more answers now is going to be to switch to the usage side. So I've done about as much as I can do confidently in terms of cleaning up obvious issues, but I think I'm kind of getting to the end of what I could do there. I'm going to need to gather a little bit more information about this API by switching to writing usage code for a little while. That might clarify some things, make it clear how I'm going to end up using things more in terms of when I'm writing this sort of generative experiment stuff. And so maybe I'll learn something there and I can come back and do another pass to make the API match the usage side better. But I don't really want to like start spending time working on cleaning up these rough parts based on like speculative theories. So I think I'm going to stop here at like a partial completion state where I've mostly got it converged, but there's a couple rough spots, and hold off on more until I have more information. With that said, there is one last thing on my to-do list that I still want to knock off, which is now that I've got a timeline, I'm going to be able to create longer sounds by composing multiple sounds together. And so it's going to be useful to be able to hear small parts at a time and sort of like instead of having to listen to the whole thing. If I have a 30-second sound, I might want to just focus on the last 10 seconds or the 1 second of the last, one particular second out of the middle or something. So to do that, I'm going to put in a little helper that'll let me window the sound after I've generated it so that I can very easily just like keep track of what part I'm listening to in the timeline at any given time while I'm iterating in the next episodes. And then I'll be done for today.